if we're talking about being heterodox with our own audience, with our own tribe, you know, I think for me, the thing I admire in others is a willingness to articulate the point of view that nobody wants to hear.
Yes.
And, you know, that point of view will differ from one audience to the next. But the point of view that is true that nobody wants to hear, or that is at least as good as the current thesis, but nobody wants an alternative thesis. And so I give you points especially for homeschooling. Even though I was not homeschooled, I haven't homeschooled my own kids so far.
I'll try not to hold that against you.
I reckon that homeschooling is a growth stock. And if we were to say what is the single most malignant and toxic organisation in Australia today, which is not run out of a prison,
right?
You know, we may speculate, we may put together a straw poll. I think Sydney University is a very toxic place today, and is a significant net cultural liability as the entire university sector. I mean, the ABC is a pretty toxic place, but we learn, you know, recently that Channel 10 is, in terms of its culture, is, you know, basically it's the same material.
Well, I would argue that journalism generally is a fairly closed shop.
Yeah,
you don't get to graduate and call yourself a journalist unless, like you said, you can reflect back to the lecturers what they would like to hear and the kinds of persuasions and points of view that they would like to hear.
Yeah. Well, there is obviously when you say to me, you know, what are we? I've worked for the ABC as a contracted regular on radio, television, and online.
Yeah.
I worked for the Sydney Morning Herald, writing columns for them for 2 years.
Yep.
Then I spent 5 years with Murdoch at Sky. I'm not really the sort of inveterate media guy. I sort of fell into media almost by accident later on in my life.
Okay.
But what we now see is two quite distinctive spheres of media. There is what is alternatively called, you know, mainstream media. It might be otherwise described as legacy media. It might be described as approved media or blue tick media. We might describe it as those who are in the racket. You know, famously, someone said it's only a racket if you're not in it.
By the way, on the blue ticks, I've been denied blue ticks on every platform that I've tried to get one on.
Yeah.
I have 50,000 followers on Facebook. I have millions of views on my videos across multiple different platforms. And that is not enough for Facebook to deem me to be a real, actual person who is of public interest.
Sure.
But there are many other blue ticks that have a fraction of the track record.
Yeah. And look, I have, you know, over, let's say 20-odd thousand followers on Twitter.
Sure.
I've never applied for a blue tick because once they stripped Julian Assange, who was easily the world's most outstanding journalist, said, well, if he can't have a blue tick, I thought, well, what's the point of wearing this laurel? Yeah. If you can't give it to the best, I don't aspire.
Yeah, fair enough.
But and you know what we are really seeing is this mirroring feature. It's not actually journalism; it's public relations. And I would say that, you know, if you drew a pie chart and said, and you were able to lump together all of the content which is generated in a single day by, the ABC, Radio Television Online, SBS, 7, 9, 10, The Guardian, The Conversation, the Australia Institute, US, NBC, MSNBC, public radio, put it all together. I would probably now, the truth is that as we're seeing this generational change, I think it's fair to say that Rupert was a more distinctive personality who had a coherent set of values that reflected an individual whose name was Rupert Murdoch. I would say that the next generation of the Murdoch family is a much more generic commodity. And we will just find that the paper under, that the Murdoch empire under, James Lachlan, and is going to just increasingly look like the ABC with ads.
Okay, let me defend them a little bit, and I will concede from the outset that you know this landscape better than I do. But let me push back a little bit, and because I'd like to hear your response on this.
Yeah,
the Murdoch empire, on the whole, and I believe to this day this remains true, but it may not, has been much more divided in terms of how newspapers will endorse a particular candidate in some elections, and they will come out on certain issues. The Murdoch media has seemed to me, when compared to Fairfax or the ABC or anything like that, to be much more diverse in who the political persuasions advocated by their senior editorial team. I know a number of the Murdoch newspapers advocated for Kevin Rudd against John Howard when that 2007 election came along. Is that not the case anymore? Do you disagree? Or is that perhaps not even a valid measure of what you're talking about? Are you talking about something entirely different?
Oh, no. Absolutely a valid measure. I mean, I regard the capacity to host diverse opinion as the first test of a media organisation.
Sure.
The Sydney Morning Herald, when they retained me to write opinion, and that was one relationship where I didn't actually get sacked, and actually quite enjoyed my time at the Herald, but the editor described me as a hygiene hire.
Right.
Where I was simply there to demonstrate that the paper had the capability to host a different opinion.
I see. So you were the diversity hire, the intellectual diversity hire.
That's right. And in the end, I found, I didn't, I declined to renew writing a fortnightly column just because I found that the column kind of dominated my life in a way that, that if I was getting paid, I suppose $1 a word or something, but it was consuming 20% of my brain space, and I couldn't afford it. But perhaps a mistake, who knows? So I don't want to. They don't bear any responsibility there. But I do say to you, I mean, the motto of the Sydney Morning Herald was, I think, in Latin, but it was, if I can remember it, in moderation all my glory, the Tory calls me Whig, and the Whig, he calls me Tory. And they were sort of saying, we are the honest broker. Equally,
we're in that middle ground. Yeah,
okay. Both sides, they're both irritated with us. And we do find these figures in modern and ancient history who managed to irritate all sides. And yet now we find an organisation like the Sydney Morning Herald, part of the Nine Entertainment Group, which I would say is just entirely incapable of more than one opinion. I mean, if you look at if we do the pie chart and say the spectrum of opinion on climate change,
Mm-hmm.
or more recent.
That's because there is no respectable difference of opinion. Haven't you heard that 97% of all the experts agree?
Yeah. The infantile quality of this. And but if we say, I then say, well, let's go to the money. Let's follow the money. And what the government has effectively done, when Justin Trudeau was asked, about his treatment by the Canadian media, he made the right observation that we did give them $600 million. And one of the biggest untold stories, and frankly, I would regard it as a scandal. It's one of those stories that you won't see reported. And we can make a long list of all the stories we know will not be reported. There may be a couple of thousand truckers who head down to Canberra to protest about COVID, who are met by a group of so-called police officers bearing machine guns, who order them when they stand under the balcony to stand in the rain to exercise their rights as citizens. But that story, you just know in your heart before you pick up the Sydney Morning Herald, the one story that is not going to be there is that story. And indeed, there is now, the Sydney Morning Herald is really defined by its silence on this vast array of issues. And but it's run, if I'm going to give, my mate, well, I want to emphasize that point. If I say to you, Topher, can you just point me to the investigative journalist who has told us how much money the Commonwealth Government Department of Health, the New South Wales Department of Health, and the Victorian Department of Health combined, how many $1 million per month are they spending on advertising in the mainstream media on COVID-related fear porn? Okay,
it's insane.
I reckon the Commonwealth is actually obligated to report the amount of money,
to disclose it.
That they spend. Now they do, in fact, have they have in the legislation or the regulation, there is an exemption from strictly reporting if a matter has to be undertaken under extremely urgent circumstances or there is some other pressing policy reason. But I say to our audience today, the idea that that the Sydney Morning Herald, they used to have a guy like, for example, who am I thinking of? Well, they had some very senior investigative reporters, who Michael West, for example.
Right.
I don't agree with Michael West on plenty of matters, but I respect him as a absolutely factual investigative journalist.
Right.
And if I'm reading Michael West, I know I'm not reading just a PR puff bull story, which I'm getting from 70% of the other so-called journalists.
Yeah.
And what has happened is the government has simply bought the editorial. So you had this extraordinary situation. If we take, say, the Sky News situation, where you've got Alan Jones, who was then also at the Daily Telegraph. Okay. So Alan Jones had a reach which I would estimate was 5 times bigger than the then editor of the Daily Telegraph.
Yeah.
The editor of the Daily Telegraph sacks Alan Jones on the basis that you are not resonating with our audience. Okay. But Alan Jones can spit over the editor's audience, whereas the editor has got to put on alpine climbing boots to get to the top of Alan Jones's audience.
Yeah.
And why you say, well, this is obviously irrational if it's a newspaper trying to build an audience, but it's not irrational if the Daily Telegraph is holding up a funnel to Greg Hunt, and Greg Hunt is pouring cash into the Daily Telegraph, so that you basically cannot turn a page or click on the screen without a piece of COVID fear porn assaulting and molesting you. And so you wind up in a situation where there's just this wave of cash running through 7, 9, 10, Herald, Telegraph, whatever. Everywhere you go, the Commonwealth is opening its purse and spending your money to buy the editorial. And so the papers just say, if Alan Jones comes out and says, well, look, I'm a bit skeptical about, some of these COVID measures. I'm sorry, mate. Out you go.
Yeah, 100%.
Doesn't matter how much your audience loves you. Doesn't matter how many people you reach. It doesn't matter if you employ 5 people to ensure the accuracy of the statements you're making, unpaid for by the station, but you do it because you never want to make a mistake.
Yeah.
That guy gets sacked.
Yeah. The actual good journalist that has integrity, unfortunately, it has a hard time finding a place in the modern media landscape or the modern journalistic landscape. This is a topic that I discussed a little bit with Matt Wong of Discernible. We had a chat. He interviewed me after the launch of the documentary, and we were talking about bias. And he put to me, are you biased? The question, is your documentary biased? 100% it is. Of course it's biased. You will not find a single piece of journalism, even from those journalists that are working incredibly hard to try and put aside their own biases. You will not find an unbiased piece of content anywhere, for the simple fact that their decision to even cover the topic is a reflection of certain biases that they hold. As you said before, there are mastheads that will not cover certain things. The choice to cover or not to cover, even if they cover factually, the choice to cover an event is in fact an act of bias in and of itself.
If you want to describe, we've just undergone in the last 2 years what even Greg Hunt describes as the greatest medical experiment in human history. Using a range of drugs which have been developed at what President Trump describes as warp speed.
Yeah.
Utilizing a technology, RNA spike protein injection, which has never been used before. And we are doing it with a level of compulsion, which is in obvious breach of the Nuremberg Convention on participation in medical experiments. Yet, if we think 7, 9, 10 of the ABC or the Sydney Morning Herald or the Daily Telegraph are going to write a single story approaching investigative journalism on vaccine injury, you're absolutely, you've got Buckley's chance reading investigative journalism about vaccine injury in any of Australia's mainstream media, because they're all on the take.
Correct.
They're in on the deal. They're in on the racket.
And we haven't even mentioned the tax rebate that the federal government gave to all the broadcasters. So they pay a fee to use bandwidth in Australia. I believe it's $41 million a year, if my memory serves me correctly. And the federal government handed them back a tax rebate, plus another, I think it was $50 million in relation to something. I'll have to go and look at the details, but there's something in the order of $91 million in tax rebates and direct funding in relation to them pushing out the government's message on the coronavirus and vaccines. And that's from a federal level, let alone all the spending. I mean, someone made the comment earlier, and I believe it's true based on some articles that came out last week. The Victorian government is the biggest advertiser in Victoria. They are the biggest source of revenue for anyone whose revenue is advertising. Now, if you think that an owner of a newspaper or a senior editor is going to sit there and allow some young up-and-coming ambitious journalist to break a big story about vaccine injuries on the front page of a newspaper that is dependent on government advertising to survive, well, I'm sorry, that story is not going to make it in there. And journalists know that, so they don't even write the story in the first place. That story never gets written because they know it will never see the light of day.
So what we find, and we could make the list when we talk about the client media, the inside club, those who are risk protected, those who are benefiting from the flow. Let's remember, the government's not spending their own money. This is the genius of the left model. is they get someone else to pay for the campaign. But I just say to, we say if the, if a Chinese news agency wishes to publish a story on YouTube or is reported somewhere in the Sydney Morning Herald, they will say, this newspaper is, this news agency is an organ of the Chinese government. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, we don't say that every time we have to look at, an ABC report, even though the ABC is entirely a creature of the government.
Yeah.
And we don't carry that warning. The thing that I object to, as a matter of, if we're talking about journalistic ethics, where journalists are allowed to, in effect, write on matters over in which their organisation has a commercial interest, but they should disclose it. And I just say I have never, in the last 2 years, where I reckon the Commonwealth government is easily, my guess is they're spending $1 million a day
it'd have to be up there.
Commercial media. I've never seen it. I've never seen a story in The Age talking about vaccine rates that says underneath, The Age newspaper receives cash sponsorship from the Federal Department of Health of $100,000 a day. I've never seen it disclosed.
No.
So I say, well, is this journalism or or something else? Well, what is it?
Yeah. And